Welcome to Applied Houdini for Volumes 2, Simulation. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to make realistic production quality smoke while creating the result you see here. By exploring many of the microsolvers that make up the main pyrosolver, we will gain an in-depth knowledge of how to precisely control the behavior of our simulation. We'll begin by examining how a high-quality input source helps produce a high-quality result, and end with some basic shading and rendering to quickly make our demo look good. Watch out for some pro tips and tricks along the way, and have fun mastering smoke simulation in Houdini now. Alright, so let's just get started. And first things first is new project. We need to keep ourselves nice and organized. So volumes 2, version 2, because this is of course the redo of the old Dynamics 1 lesson. Now we have the project saved, we need to save the actual file itself in the project, so click on job. Job is the project path that we just set. So we'll say volume version 2.0. Version 0 of version 2 of volumes 2. Crazy, right? So there's that. We've got a 240 frame long scene here. That's 10 seconds long. That's too much. Let's just change it. Click on that little button down there for the animation options. We'll make it half as long. It'll only be 5 seconds long. Here we're gonna have to simulate and render each frame, and I think we'll get the idea after 5 seconds, which 120 frames is. Click on the clock to make sure that it only plays back that fast, and we're on our way. So, as we know from volumes 1, we're going to deal with the smoke in the viewport a lot, and if we don't have actual lights to illuminate various details, it will just be flat shaded. So we can change lights around later, but let's have a default lighting setup. So click skylight, and it actually makes 2 lights. It will make the environment light, which is this kind of general sky color, and then this will be a specific light that casts most of the light. That's literally the sun. I don't like seeing the skylight in the viewport, so turn off enable light in viewport. It's still on, it's just we don't see it in the viewport. So that's good. Let's make our source. Our smoke's going to come from a source every frame. We're not going to just start from, you know, the pig head smoke. We're going to start from a little small source that will keep adding smoke into our simulation every frame. So we'll use a sphere. We'll make it into a polygon sphere. We'll give it 10 frequency. I just want lots of points around it because I want to move those points. I want to make it interesting. The recurring theme in this lesson, and really in many dynamics kind of things, is that an interesting input leads to an interesting output. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say in programming, and the same is true in simulations. We want not garbage in, we want cool stuff in. So, starting from a sphere, for example, would be a boring thing. Starting from this is more interesting. Even better would be if this moved. I can move the time slider here on the mountain stop we just made, but, you know, I don't want to manually do this every frame, which you couldn't do anyway. Let's put a time attribute here. This will evaluate, as you can see, to the current time in seconds in the scene. So now it moves. So that's cool. If you're wondering why you get like hard edges and stuff here and there, it won't ultimately matter, but if you do care, you can press D in the viewport, go to geometry, and go to this cusp angle thing, and just put 360 so it never does it. That's cusping, where it's letting us view it. I don't know why this is a feature, to be honest with you. It doesn't affect rendering, it only affects the viewport, so I don't really know the point of that is. Anyway, turn that off. It's gone now. Now we don't have to worry about it. So that's going to be an interesting source. The last thing we'll do in this little opening chapter is let's control-click camera. And that brings us back out to the object area here. Click the lock so that the camera moves with us. Otherwise, as you remember, if we move the perspective camera, we pop out of it. So stay in it, lock it. I would say let's find some way, something like this. I don't know. This is probably fine. We just want the source to be towards the bottom. And I don't know, is that good? I'll do like that. I'll just round these off for you. So if you're following along at home, you could honestly put the camera wherever, but you know, this is fine too. So something like that. Let's see. There. Good. We can always move it later. So that seems fine. And that's enough for one chapter. On to the main event, which is going to be the actual way we generate the volumes that go into the simulation. That's going to be the input of our simulation. Last lesson, we saw we converted the pig head and loaded it in one time. In this lesson, we're going to make a new volume on every frame and add that in every time. Now we're gonna create density volume. That'll be the actual smoke. We're going to create a temperature volume, which is not a specific number like, you know, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's more of a relative temperature. If I add like a temperature of 1 here and the area around it is 0, then we just know that this area is hotter than this area and by a relative amount. So we're going to add smoke, we're going to add temperature, and we're going to add velocity. Velocity, as we know well by now, is what moves stuff around. But the temperature itself, the temperature also will help move things because heat rises. And smoke, whenever we have smoke, it's usually because some chemical reaction is happening, maybe fire, things that involve heat. So the movement of smoke is actually very closely tied to the movement of temperature. So I want to talk about that in this lesson, which is something I did not do in the first version of this. So, good thing you're watching it now. In any case, so we're going to make a source. And to make a source, we're going to want to make a pyro source. Pyro source doesn't do all that much, to be honest. You need more than just this node. You're going to need a lot more than just this node. But just to get started, the workflow now in Houdini 17 is to start from particles. We're going to add attributes to these particles, these points in space, and then we'll convert that into a volume. So that's where we're heading. So what we can do is go to its source smoke, and you'll see it's going to make 2 attributes, density and temperature, which I just talked about. This will be the actual smoke coming in, and this will be the temperature at that space, which will later inform how it moves, in addition to velocity. So, again, it's not doing a whole lot. It's just making a density attribute and setting it to 1. And this is per point. This is not a volume yet. If we go to geometry spreadsheet, you'll see it's just a bunch of points, density, temperature, with a size, p scale. Means particle scale. It's literally the radius of the diameter. I can't remember now. I'll add it as an annotation that you're probably seeing now. I can never remember. Oh, well, there's the answer, actually. It must be the radius. Okay. So, particle separation, 0.1. Now, if I change this, it won't do anything. The reason why, it probably changes it here. It does. You see, it just doubles it. The reason why is because this is set to keep input, which is to say, it's just putting points on the surface. Or rather, it's just taking the points that are already on the surface, I should say. So change this, because we want to make volumes. I usually find it more useful to at least do a surface scatter, where, you know, now the smaller the particle separation is, meaning the less space there is between them, the more particles there will be. Even better, this is fine if an object is on fire, meaning it's being sourced right at the surface. You can often get more interesting results with a volume scatter, where it's just a thickness. It's just a dense grid. Now, this is a regularly spaced grid, as you can see, which is fine, because this is going to be turned into voxels, and voxels are regularly spaced pile of cubes, as you know from the last lesson. At least I hope you do, or else you shouldn't be watching this one. So, particle separation, we'll just start it at, let's say, something even smaller than this. Let's make it like a third of that. So it's a very thick, that's cool, whee. It's a very dense grid, which will be turned into a very dense volume later on. You can always jump back into this camera if we like to. Now, we're going to drive this number later by other things, but for now, that's enough. So let's make a volume rasterize attributes. This will actually make the volume. So, where is the volume? Well, we don't really see anything yet because we haven't actually told it what to rasterize. We need to rasterize density and the temperature. And there you go. We actually have two volumes here on top of each other, but it's for our purposes, it's fine. You can see if I get rid of the temperature, it will be a little less visible, but that's okay. I mean, it's generally the same idea. So density and temperature. So right off the bat, we have a voxel size here. We're going to make this one be our master control, or at least until our simulation actually drives this one. But in the meantime, go to copy parameter and dump that right here on particle separation. Paste relative references. So now it's the same number. Let's make this one be 0.03 now. So as we scrub through it, you can see we have smoke. Again, this will be added to our simulation every frame. Everything in there will be added in every frame. We're not going to just load one of these. You can see how fast it is. It's much faster than the old tool set, which is what this is replacing. Mostly because, honestly, this uses VDBs now. VDBs are a sparse grid version of volumes, meaning that in areas, let's see if we can see it, in areas that we don't have information, we don't store information. So you can see the VDB is actually represented by these blue cubes here, which is pretty cool. All of this area out here is not actually storing any information. So it can be clever with memory consumption, and it can also just have it has other technology that is beyond me, that helps it just build these volumes out faster from data like this. So in any case, it is fast, as you can see. So that's cool. Fast is always better. Yeah, so that's enough of that. Now everything we're doing, and all the time you're often going to spend on doing a volume simulation, or a smoke simulation, if you will, is, you know, adding more detail. We always want more detail because we're always fighting against memory limitations. And, you know, if we could simulate every particle of smoke, like literally every particle of the trillions upon numbers we can't even imagine, only then would we have a completely 100% accurate simulation. So until then, we have to deal with, like, you know, maybe 120 million voxels or whatever. So the point is, we have to do a lot with a little. So we need to set ourselves up for success by having interesting inputs. You know, we at least have it all lumpy like this now. But let's go farther. Now here we have points, and here we have a volume. Now this is taking the density and temperature attributes and making this. As we just saw, these are all set to 1 right now. So let's modify those numbers. Let's have them not just be 1, so that this can take those values and have it like be more broken up. I don't want it to just be solid. I want it to be essentially a noise. Somebody say noise? Attribute noise. So look at that. Drop an attribute noise in here. Location attribute is what it looks up into the noise. P is correct. We're always going to keep that. We want the position to be where it looks up into the noise. And then the result is something else. The result is this CD here, color. So you can see we have cool colors. Like with our mountain before, it's not animated right now. So turn on animated to fix that. So now you can see the color changes over time. Now I don't care about color. That's not how we're going to make this input more interesting. We want it to actually change the density and temperature. Now I'm going to do both at once because, again, where there's more density, meaning more smoke, I'm also going to assume that there's more temperature in that area also. Again, because whatever made the smoke probably released temperature. And if there's more of it, there's probably more temperature. You know, that may or may not be true. You could break it out. You could have, you know, 2 attribute noises where one does density and one does temperature. I'm not going to do that. For the sake of simplicity, we'll do it at 1. And I think, honestly, I'm often just doing it that way anyway. So here we are back here. If I disable this, you can see it's doing something. Well, it's not 100% clear yet what I'm doing. Here's the noise type, simplex. Keep that, that's fine. Mode, additive. So this could be returning positive or negative numbers, so additive can still mean that it's subtracting values away. I find it more intuitive to imagine that we are multiplying it. And to that effect, I want to have center noise. So this will definitely return positive and negative values. And negative values are being multiplied by it, which is why it looks crazy right now. What I essentially really want, though, is for the negative numbers really to go to 0. So we can do a post-process, make it minimum output is 0. So it kind of just clamps it. So we were getting a lot of values that were negative. So let's say the result of this, in fact, is between -1 and 1. You could literally remap it to be that, but we're not going to do that. If by clamping it after here to be 0, that means half of the range that it returns is just 0. But that is kind of what I want. I want to knock out a lot of the areas. So you can see we went from this to this, and that's fine. We don't need it to be solid. This is totally cool. So it's animated, it's centered, we've knocked out the post here, and honestly the only other thing I want to do is add more roughness. Roughness is an easy way to just get more little detail into it. So you can see the less rough it is, the more blah it is, and we add this, and now we have lots of little bits. So again, little bits means that we'll get little details, lots of little sources all over the place, and all kind of combine and swirl. Like, again, it's all about setting ourselves up for success even before we get into the simulation proper. So that's pretty good. I'm going to actually maybe scale back a little bit. I don't want it to be sand, because then it's just complete noise. But 0.8 is fine. 1 is probably fine also, but I'm going to do 0.8. It makes me feel like I did something. Cool. Last thing we'll do here, make a null. This will be our source, and let's actually start bringing this into our simulation. All right, so let's go back to the first frame to not make our sim mad while we make it. Go back out to the object area here, start to tab type .network. Now, it's funny, the simulation network has a default color. I don't know, I like to change it to purple. I think because I started doing this before they had a default color, and I have the green for the helper geometry that is not rendered, purple for the simulation and related things, and then red for stuff that's actually rendered. I don't know, it doesn't really matter. So, we got a simulation network. Cool, we'll dive into that. Just like last lesson, we need a pyrosolver. We need a smoke object. And that's something, and that's enough for a moment. But I can still see my source out there, right? Now you can see the cache filling up. I mean, there's nothing running in here. That source is not in here yet, of course, but it is helpful to see it. Let's make this thing just be a big old box, 10 by 10 by 10. Now, right now, it's just sitting on the floor. I'm going to imagine our y equals 0 grid here is the floor. So let's make the center be half of whatever the y is here. That way it's always resting on the floor. If it's centered at 0.5 and it's 10, that means it goes 5 in each direction from 5. And you can see that works. This is a good point. Our source is actually in the ground. Let's move that up. So I'm going to jump back over to the source here. Let's put a transform after the thing here. There we go. Now it's just on the ground. So that's cool. Okay. And so we can see it's sitting on the ground now. So that's nice. What else we got to do in this cool box thing here? Let's turn on closed boundaries right off the bat, because we know, again, that the bottom y, meaning the negative y, is going to be solid, it's going to be ground. This is a quick and easy way of having the simulation know that. So closed boundaries and the negative y, that's an easy one. Let's also do our division. I like to do the division method by max axis. You can say like the voxels are this size. But in my head, I tend to, at least for the past couple of years, I tend to try to kind of home in on 300 voxels for when I'm doing work in the viewport that's fairly high res. And then I'll do 600 for my final, and 150 actually the lowest when I'm really just getting started sketching this out. So 150 will be along the max axis. Now all three axes are 10. So effectively it's going to be 10 divided by 150. That number is going to be literally the same as just putting that number in the division size. But again, I don't usually want to have to figure that out. So 150. So that's something. And let's say while we're talking about that, let's just take one of these, this first one. I'm going to say copy parameter. We'll go over to source. And what we can do is we can use that to calculate, again, the voxel size. So paste absolute references. So it just says 10 now. So the voxel size is 10, which obviously breaks everything. Go back. I should have just had my usual network and parameter window, but I don't think I saved it for this new version. Oh well. So the other thing is copy the uniform divisions here, the 150 number. Go back to the source. Click in here. Say divide by, then paste. What the hell? And then paste absolute references. There you go. So there's the number that it calculated. So it's even smaller than, or no, it's actually bigger than what we had. But that's fine. So now this is being calculated, and we're never going to generate a volume that has more detail than our actual simulation, or has less detail, and then we're wasting time in our simulation. Either way, we just want to keep everybody in sync. So this is set to this what the simulation's doing, and this is set to what that's doing, which is, of course, in turn what the simulation's doing. So very good. So as we change these numbers around, those will update for us already. And because we're working with low-res stuff, if you have a graphics card that is up to the task, I would say click the Pyro Solver, go to use OpenCL. This will help it to run noticeably faster. If you get OpenCL errors, like you get a little window that says OpenCL kernel or can't allocate memory buffer, or really anything that mentions OpenCL at all, just come back here and turn it off. I'm hoping, I have an 11 gig card as of this recording, so this should be enough for this. So I'm going to keep it on. I mean, it'll help simulate faster, which is better for you. Finally, we're not going to do actual combustion. We're not going to do like actual gas explosion stuff in this lesson. We will do it very soon, but not, I mean, they already exist. You can just check those lessons out. That's volumes 5 and 6. But we're not doing it now, so turn it off. It'll still do our temperature stuff, but not actual combustion. So there we go. And we also don't want any default shape stuff that might be on the Pyro Solver. We're going to make these things ourselves and have more control over in the process. Okay, and the last thing is let's actually source in what we did. So volume source, not vellum source. Put it there. You'll see the last input here says sourcing. So just connect it. We want to source smoke. It doesn't say anything when you say source smoke. You have to choose something else and then go back to it. So that's fun. So you can see we have density, volume, which we know we made. We have a temperature volume, which we know we made. And a velocity volume. Well, we didn't make that. I guess we'll have to do that. In the meantime, it will just not find it and not worry about it. So go to, for our source here, or for our SOP path rather, object, source, the thing that we made. Now I'm going to say hide other objects. Now I don't want to see the other stuff, because I want to make sure that it finds it and actually simulates it. So there it is, our first simulation. It's pretty incredible. You know, we did a lot in terms of setting up our source to make for an interesting result, but obviously there's a lot further we have to go. But nonetheless, a dynamic source is still something to be proud of. And it still looks kind of interesting on the bottom there. Now, one thing we're fighting against is... actually, no, ignore that. One last thing I want to say before we talk about that. We want to talk about some of the visualizers on here, just real quick. Right now we have density on. That's literally the smoke itself. But wouldn't you know it, we have temperature. And that comes up in like a slice here. So this is pretty cool. You can actually see how, if I didn't even want to render the smoke, we already have essentially flame in many ways. I don't know what that flash is. Ignore that. So here we go. This is a visualization of the temperature in the system. This is what we've been adding that in. Remember, the temperature volume. We can click on the temperature tab here. As you can see, the default is that use plane, whereas the default is use smoke. We could actually not use this and use smoke. Now this is just showing us this is where the temperature is. So visualizers are cool ways of just doing it however you want. We can move the plane through it, so it's like an MRI or a CAT scan or something, to see where the temperature is. Black body makes sense. Black body radiation is what is the way we see temperature as humans. Things that are black are not exuding enough temperature. But if you imagine metal that gets very hot, turns red, then yellow, then white, then blue, as you see with flames on your stove. That's what black body radiation is, and that's why that's the default. You can change it. There's infrared. You've probably seen that too in movies and things. That's perfectly legitimate. Just wanted to point out that these are here. You can use these to debug things. Typically, we are just going to stick with density. So there you go. I'm going to keep it there. But we know that there is temperature in the system. We know, in fact, that that's what's making this move. If I said on our source, do not add temperature, scale 0, literally multiply the incoming temperature by 0. Now you can see this doesn't move anymore. What little movement it appears to be doing is not really movement. That's just because of the mountain and attribute noise sourcing, the smoke in different places. But if you scrub through it, you can see it's not actually simulating. It's just adding stuff on top of each other. And the places that it's adding to are different over time, but it's not moving. There's no velocity. In fact, we could always visualize velocity. So, turn it on. Now, we don't see anything, so it's hard to tell if it's even on or not. If I turn the temperature back on, we don't want that much. Revert to default, so we'll do 1. You can see we have velocity now. That's what this crazy field is. There's too many velocity vectors here for us to see clearly. So go back to velocity here. See, override divisions. Do like something less, so 50 by 50. Again, a visualization thing. We can again use whatever we want to visualize it. The default's fine, just change those divisions. And you can see we get velocity. Now we didn't add velocity into our sim ourselves. Remember, we didn't make one. The temperature, though, the temperature is the temperature that is making the velocity. So I'm going to do, this is a perfect example of, I'm going to go to temperature here. I'm going to move the plane back a little bit so we can see both. And now you can see the temperature is what's creating the velocity. Heat rises. That's it. That's really the entire thing you need to understand. Heat rises. It rises relative to cold areas. So if everything is cold up here, that's why it's black, and obviously we haven't added temperature in everywhere, the heat here wants to move up. And as those velocity vectors point up, everything else around it kind of swoops in underneath, and you get this convection swirling here. So this is all governed on the simulation, on the Pyro solver here, by temperature diffusion. Will cause the temperature to move out to the sides. It'll blur it. But the buoyancy lift, that's what controls how fast it moves. And the buoyancy direction, up, is which direction it moves. So it's going to move up, it's going to move this fast, and it's also going to spread out a little bit. So, for example, if I were to, oopsies, don't do that. If I were to say 50, and this is always a good idea to change things by multiples of 10 to quickly see the result of a parameter, you'll see that this will move way faster. If that was useful to you for some reason, there it is. Typically, that's, you know, this is good for scale, for trying to get a different scale. If you wanted it maybe to seem like a much larger sim, maybe you would make the buoyancy less so that it moves slower. Whenever you make something move slower, it seems bigger. For our purposes, we're going to keep it at the default. But that is that. I'm going to turn off those guides now, though. Temperature and velocity. And let's move on. So, we got it working, and part of why it doesn't look so hot, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. We got a long way to go, but I don't have that far to go, really. Anyway, you know, we want more detail. So what's controlling the detail? Well, again, it's the divisions. It's how many voxels there are. We talked about that at length in volumes 1, and it's still true now. So I'm going to go from 150 to 300. We now have twice as much detail on each axis, which again, as we talked about last lesson, means there is 8 times as many voxels now. In fact, if I were to middle click and hold on any of these, you'll see there are now 27 million voxels. It's a lot. When this was just 150, this was, we gotta go to 1 frame. We had a mere 3 million voxels. So, you know, 8 times that apparently is 27 million. So we do want to go up, though. I mean, we don't have a choice. So it's much slower now. We can see more detail already, though. Can't argue with that. But it's slower. Is it workable? I mean, sure. I mean, if a simulation ultimately takes an hour to run, I mean, so be it. If it looks good, who cares? But we still want to work around this as fast as we can. So one way we can make this run faster is we know on these early frames, for example, we don't need all of this extra space. We're simulating right here. From frame to this frame, there's not going to be that much difference in terms of where it is. You know, the temperature is building up, and the buoyancy will start to move it forward, but there's no real risk of this all of a sudden being up here, and we need to have all that. Meanwhile, the simulation is forced to solve everything. So all this stuff is being solved by the pyrosolver, and that's just a waste of time. It's a waste of memory, but, you know, if you're not using the memory for anything else, who cares? It is always a waste of time, though. So, to fix that, make a gas resized fluid dynamic. I know this one has the icon on it, but click this one. Drop that onto the pre-solve. And what gas resized fluid dynamic will do is it will look at a field density, and it will say, for all the voxels that are less than this, so this is a very low number. Essentially, we're looking for voxels that have nothing in it. 0.05 is probably not going to show up in a render, is the theory, with this default number. So it's going to track all the voxels that don't have anything in it. And if it can make clean slices off of it, or it can drop off an entire, you know, axis worth, it will do so. And then make the simulation that much faster. So boom, look at that. So in the first frame, you had nothing all of these places. Then it added a little smoke. And now it's just way faster. So you can see we're already getting to this stage where we had to wait forever before. So it's much, much, much faster. So what it's doing is, on every frame, it says, again, find out, are there voxels that are empty? Now there are voxels that are empty here, but it gives us a padding also. Because again, it might move into those areas. And then when it does, it will, again, reevaluate and say, okay, we need padding. So it's doing both things. It's cutting it down to size from here, but then it's also potentially increasing the size so that it always has a buffer area around where the smoke is. and it's just way faster to simulate, the voxels themselves are the same size. So this, uniform divisions being 300, it's not that this small thing is now 300 voxels. It just means that at its greatest, at its maximum that it can get back to, this was 300 voxels, and this is the size. So knowing that, it keeps the voxel size the same. You can see here, well, it actually doesn't say it, but the voxel size is the same. You have a few options on here. We've got initialization static. That's what I just described, where the initialization frame, the first frame, these are the maximum extents and the sizes. There's initialization dynamic, which basically means, and I'll have a little demo pop up here, you can give it an object here to track. So if this is an airplane flying by, or a comet or something that's not just steady in space, it will move the entire pyro bounds with it. It'll still be, hence initialization, it'll still have all the same, it'll have the same maximum bounds, but they'll be centered around the object that you give. There's from object, which also asks for an object. That's when you literally just supply a box you made yourself in SOP somewhere to say these are the bounds no matter what. Not usually terribly useful. And manual is even less useful, where you just say the maximum bounds yourself. I mean, we did that already here with the size and center. So if you needed to change it later for some reason manually, you could do it here. You're rarely ever going to use those two. You're going to use initialization static most of the time, and initialization dynamic, again, for fast moving, for objects that are moving around the screen. So we'll keep it at static. Honestly, dynamic will do the same thing if it's not given an object to track anyway. So really, in a way, you're always going to use an initialization dynamic. I'll keep it on static for now. Very good. Now, there is something wrong here, though. See how it had to build up over many frames like this? That's not really right. When we made this source, it was already this big. It's this big all the time. This thing screwed up. It did a good job, but it didn't do a great job. You need to help it out a little bit. It didn't know. Basically what it did was it collapsed to essentially having nothing. And the only reason why it's even this big is because of the padding. So what we can do is we can help it out. And that's what this tracking object does. Tracking object says you need to at least make sure that you include this. Make this, set this to the source, the same source as before. Again, this thing. So this has bounds, as you can see. So what this says is you have to make sure that you include, that you look in these areas at least to see if there's any density when you do your consideration of how much to chop down. So now you'll see immediately it's correct. It will look at that and say, oh, even though there's not density there on this first frame, because there's density nowhere, there is density here as if it were already in the sim, and therefore it will not exclude that from its little calculation. So there you go. Now we've got the gas resize fluid dynamic working. It's crazy to think that on every frame it's creating and destroying an entire voxel grid's worth of data. But it is way, way, way faster for computers to allocate memory and copy memory, meaning the density, temperature, whatever values, than it is for Pyro to actually do its solve. So it's still favorable for the gas resize fluid dynamic to destroy this entire voxel grid, create the small one, copy the values from here to here, and then do the sim, than it is to just do the sim at the extents. Every single frame, it's destroying the entire grid, copying over the old values, and then continuing. But again, the proof is in the pudding. It's quite fast. So, if you're not sick of me saying that we need to add more detail into this by now, well, maybe you will be. That's going to be the mantra again for the rest of this thing. So right off the bat, we can see, well, this sucks. You know, when we see this huge bald area, I call these mushrooms. They look like mushrooms growing to me. But even in general, the source itself could just be better in terms of its dynamicism. It kind of just comes into being and goes. And we know that a general setup kind of expects an incoming velocity, and we have not actually provided that. So let's go do that. Maybe that will solve some of our problems. It will. I tell you, it will. It'll solve some of them. So we created our density and temperature. Now I want to create on a parallel branch here. I want to create velocity. So first off, we had this notion here a moment ago where we had the mountain moving. And these points are moving. We can calculate velocities for them. So use the trail, like so. Put this here. The trail, you can go compute velocity, and you can see by clicking on this, it makes the volume trails. Kind of hard to see. They are trails, meaning unlike, let's say, normals, which point outwards in the direction of the vector, these point the opposite direction because they're meant to be like velocity streaks. So when we see them sticking out on this side, it's because they're actually moving in. So you can see how like this, they're moving that way. And then when they come at us, we can't see them because they're pointing inside. So one thing that I think maybe might be more intuitive, a nice little feature of Houdini 17 is when we are on one of these things here, a node, click the eye, and you'll see the various, I don't know why it's screwed up there, but you can see the various attributes. You can see they're underlined. If you click it, it will visualize that attribute. So there you go. So now we have the vectors pointing in the direction and with the size of the vector, much as if it were, again, normals pointing in the same direction. So I think it's just maybe a little easier to see. So we have velocity on these, but if I were to let the pyrosource take it, it does not transfer over. As you can see, a middle click, there is no V, which I guess kind of makes sense. You know, these are grid points that are just being created in place based on the geometry extents. So it doesn't really know how, it could probably guess on how to transfer them over, but it doesn't. So let's force the issue. Attribute transfer. Can't I spell today? Attribute transfer. So this will say, take these points and copy something from this into them. So now you can see we have those points. There's a lot more points now. And we're going to literally transfer, we can be more specific. We say just transfer the velocity over. So again, it's taking these surface points, which are hollow on the inside, and it will just say for every point in here, just find the closest point to you. So max sample count will say, what means look within 10 units of me, or don't, just look as far as it takes. Find the first sample, meaning the first point on here, that you find and just copy that velocity over. That's enough. So now we have points that have velocities. And as you recall from this, it's those point values that we're turning into a volume. So that's why we want every point to have a velocity on them, because we're going to do the same thing. So speaking of doing the same thing, let's literally copy the volume rasterized attributes and point it to this one instead. And it's doing density and temperature right now. Let's do V. V is the attribute, to reiterate, V for velocity. And it looks like smoke, so it's hard to really tell what it is that we're seeing. So let's not look at it this way. Much like how in the PyroSim, the visualizer were all those little velocity streaks. That's the preferred way. And a dandy way of putting that together is go to volume slice. And now we're visualizing the velocity by color, where the direction of the velocity, XYZ, is being remapped to RGB. That works pretty well, but it can be problematic when velocities are negative, because negative color values are not going to look like anything, really. They'll be black. So let's do a volume trail, where we advect the points of that based on the velocity, and then there you go. And then we're back to our familiar velocity visualization. So it's working. We are creating a velocity field, as we can see here. See, by the time we get to here, we've created actual geometry. So if we middle click and hold here, you'll see it's just polygons and vertices. So be careful. This is where the actual volume is. Before we forget even, let's merge that into here. So now we had a density and temperature volume. Now we have a V volume, merge all together. Now we have that third volume that our pyrosolver was looking for. Or rather, the volume source was looking for. You can see it's looking for a source volume called V, because it knows in Houdini, the standard kind of became over time that V was the name of the attribute in SOPs when dealing with points. But in Pyro, the field is actually called vel. Field means voxel grid, or just volume in general. They are synonymous. It's just in a dynamic setting, it's referred to as a field. So at any rate, it is a vector volume that then is added to the vel field. Again, the vel field being what Pyro is looking for. We can always, if you ever forget, you can go to the visualizer for velocity, and you should see it in there. Well, it's not actually in there. Ignore that. I was kind of just hoping that it was. If you go over to here, maybe, hold your mouse over it. No, not there either. Oh well. In any case, it is. Oh, there we go. Field tab. So you can see it is the vel field. Velocity is vel. Very good. So that is the velocity field. We can just use that as is and just see, like, what does this look like? Do we have any more dynamic motion? We definitely do. We can see it now. It's going in all these different directions. Now we have lots of little mushrooms, so it's better. It's certainly more interesting. It's still not great. One thing we can do easily, at least, is to break up the velocity itself. Much like we did right here with attribute noise. So we could just create another attribute noise, or copy that one over. I'm going to create a new one. Attribute noise, this one is going to, again, it's always going to look up. The location attribute is always going to be P, because each point is going to look up into the volume, into the noise field that we can't see, based on where it is. So, V. Now again, we had V already. Coming here, you can see V is being changed. We're adding to it this simplex noise like before. We want to be animated. We definitely want to be centered now. Because if we don't, it's going to add a lot of positive vectors. You can actually see that happening. It looks like a Dragon Ball Z haircut here. See how the X, Z, and Y's here with I'm pointing at this little thing down here that shows us our axes. See how they're all positive in the directions that they're facing. That's why it's blowing out in that direction. We want to center the noise so that we're getting negative and positive values. So now it's pointing every which way. So that's cool. If I turn it off, turn it on, you can see it's doing something. It actually is probably more useful to look at the end result while we're doing this. So coming back to here. In fact, I'm going to pin this. Click pin on the attribute noise. Or actually, don't even bother. Let's just turn off this visualizer. We don't need to see that anymore. So we can see if I turn this off, it goes from being that to being that. We definitely have way more interesting motion here. You can play with this. I'm going to say, let's make it smaller. We want to have more. You can see the detail getting bigger and smaller in here, can't we? So that's cool. I'm going to say this is probably fine. 0.5. Look at those cool curls. How rad is that? That should be enough. Let's see what that gets us. And again, we're visualizing it here, but the actual result of it is coming into here, into the source. So I'm going to go back into my camera. I'm going to say, let's actually run this whole thing and see what we've got. and then we'll move on to the actual microsolvers that will really make this shine. So here's the result. Pretty cool. Something I noticed is, and I've seen this bug happening. It went to 200. I mean, it would have gone forever. Or actually, it probably would have gone to 240, even though we told it to only do 120. The flipbook settings say RF end, which is this number. I've seen this happening in Houdini 17. You could always just type it in yourself, or you might have to jostle it here in the timeline maybe to get it to actually be set correctly. All I know is setting it here clearly didn't do it. So, I don't know. Just be careful. Anyway, I only want to look at 120 frames, so I'm just going to set it here. So there it is. You can see that now it's like billowing. See how it's like blowing at the source? So that's more what I want to see. And of course, it's also breaking it up more in the get-go. Now again, this is a kind of a default look. This is what you're going to get without any further work in the simulation. This is probably as good as it's going to get in terms of just controlling the sourcing. But of course, we can do much more than that in the simulation itself. So let's go do that. So in Pyro, there's an idea of microsolvers. Microsolvers, there's quite a bunch of them. I can see so many of them won't even show up. There we go. There's a lot of them. We don't need to learn most of them, but there's a lot, and some of them are more integral, lower level, just parts of the Pyro solver in general that you'd never really need to touch. But many of them are actually quite useful and are actually what is here on the shape tab. These 6 are the ones that you use the most. But again, they kind of just abstract out some of the parameters and have some odd defaults, and I don't know. I don't use it because sometimes you want more than one of each. There's just like whatever. It's fine that it's there for quick and dirty stuff, but let's just do it the normal way. So, gas dissipate, for example, has diffusion and evaporation rate, evaporate by subtraction stuff, whereas if you just look at it on the dissipation tab, it has, well, nothing. You have a 0.1. You can go see what that's hooked up to inside, but you just don't get all of the actual control that you actually get from the real gas dissipate. So, point taken, hopefully. So these things, just plug into the middle one here. You see it says velocity update. Much of these deal with the velocity. This one actually doesn't, but nonetheless, really this is just an order that they're run in, so it's just as well. You can put this here or anywhere. So gas dissipate is going to do what it sounds like. It's going to make it disappear. That's cool, but it also can do diffusion. Diffusion meaning blurring. So it can blur out and it can subtract. So evaporation rate is a percentage of, well, as it says literally right here, an evaporation rate of 0.1 means 10% will be lost in a second, which is 24 frames. So this is just kind of reducing it all the time, whereas evaporate by subtraction would literally be like, whatever the value is, subtract, let's say, 0.5 from it. So you could turn that on as well. So here I am with 0.5 on. In fact, let's do 1. This means that it will literally remove 100% of the smoke every second. So you can see it's barely getting anywhere. In fact, it's getting nowhere. We're probably more or less just seeing the source on every frame. Let's dial back some. So now it has long enough to live a little bit, but it's never going to get that far. The stuff that's alive the longest, essentially, is going to keep getting hit by this, where it's saying reduce 70%, reduce 70%, over 24 frames. So really, this divided by 24. But you can see it's almost gone now by the time it gets here. So this simulation will probably never get much bigger than around here. It's also very thin, and if you remember this that we had over here, around frame 74 it looked like that, and here we are at frame 74 right now. So you can see, very different. But you know, useful. This looks like a very ashy kind of look to it, doesn't it? Like if you have um, maybe steam, the way steam works when it comes out of, let's say, a factory, it's water vapor. It quickly kind of just becomes absorbed into the air. We don't really see it anymore. So to get a steam effect, you would have a very high dissipation. We could also do a very high diffusion where it blurs everything. That's terrible. You usually want to stay away from that. All this love of details goes right out the window when we have a high diffusion. We want some diffusion because it should diffuse over time, just not like that. So I like to just start with just a touch of, just a touch. This is not much. We probably won't even notice that much. It's more important to realize that, let's say, over the course of the shot, 120 frames, that's 5 seconds. So it's going to, basically, this is going to happen to completion five times. So in a way, 25% of the original smoke will have blurred and will have disappeared straight up, which is reasonable. Over time, I would expect it to have a kind of, hazy look to it. So let's see. Here we are at frame 70 again. It looks about the same, but not 100% the same, but fairly similar. Maybe as we get towards the end, it will look even different, more different. I can see here that this is definitely less than this now. Oh, yeah, I should catch up in the frame. Let's just wait for it at the end. I'm going to say frame 120, because we're zooming in on that now anyway. We can definitely start to see how these edges are getting softer up here. These areas out here have been completely reduced down to almost nothing, whereas you can see they remain very sharp. Everything here is very sharp at the end, and while that is nice, it's also not very realistic. You look at any reference for smoke and you'll see there'll be like kind of a hazy layer towards the bottom. Okay, so that's enough for diffusion. I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory. It blurs and it subtracts. So there you go. So now all of a sudden we're going to have something that looks really good. This is not really good. This is still bad. Let's go to really good now. Really good is usually accomplished with disturbance. What gas disturbance does, and we're going to talk about turbulence later, which is like just general windiness. That's probably what you're thinking, like, disturbing. Gas disturbance is actually much more specific. What gas disturbance is going to do is it's going to take the edges of your simulation and perturb the velocity right there in very small ways to get lots of granular detail along the edges. So we obviously took up our slot here. If I were to replace it, it would knock this guy out. What you're going to need to do is make a merge. So merge these together, and now, so much like the merge when you are in the SOPs area, this is not combining two pieces of geometry together. This is just saying, this thing is saying do these things in order, and then this is saying do these in this order, and that's just a sub order. So when this part triggers, it will then do these two in order. So it's just a way to have more than one. So gas disturbance. So that's what disturbance does in a nutshell. It will look along the edges. That's what this cutoff means. Cutoff says where the smoke is, well, that's not coming up, but there it is. When the density is less than 0.1, the reference field, they call it. That's what, or the threshold field. So when the threshold field, again, the density, is less than 0.1, apply the gas disturbance in that area. How big should the noise be? That's this block size. This is in world units, so 0.3. Keep in mind, we know what the size of our voxels is. Right now it's 0.03. What can be helpful is sometimes to make a literal box. Oop, that's a bone. Make an actual box and make it be the size that we want to see. I'm going to move this to the side. There we go. It's very small. See that little dot right there? That's how big our voxel is. I'm going to call this helper. Helper box. Now, it'll be bigger if it was closer to the camera or something, like if it was over here maybe. But nonetheless, it's quite small. So that's useful to us. You know, when we want to see how big our noise should be, just keep in mind the size of the helper box. So I'm going to turn that off. Now, to begin with, 0.3, that's interesting. That's, 10 times as large. Let's just see what that looks like. Oh, actually, one thing I should also say. By default, on the gas disturbance here, it says disturb field, the actual field that we're going to apply our result to. You might think that it's going to add to the velocity. By default, it doesn't. It actually will it'll apply a noise to the edges of the temperature field. I find it more intuitive to change this to velocity. And if you change it to velocity, the disturbed field is a vector field. Temperature is not a vector field, it's just regular numbers, it's just scalar numbers. So velocity, disturbed field is a vector field. Let's pop back into the camera. Let's see what that does. We're not going to simulate the whole thing, but let's just see what that does. We can see immediately there's a lot happening here. See how those mushrooms are never really getting a chance to form? We're seeing a very strong force acting on the edges of everything. Like so. Probably too much. I mean, definitely too much. This could be an effect. This could be useful for something. It's not really what I want to go for. I want it to be a more subtle. I want essentially the motion we had before, just not with those crazy mushroom things. So what I'm ultimately just seeing here is it's either too strong or the size of it is too big. And I'm going to say from experience that the size is too big. 0.3 is fairly large. If we bring our helper box back, that looks like this. That's big. I just want a granular modification on the edges. 0.3 is a fairly large feature. I can see that feature. So I'm going to go back into here and say, let's try doing 0.1, or even, like I said before, doing this in like powers of 10 is often the quickest way to see the results of something. We can always tweak it from there. So let's see what that looks like. Oh. I bet this looks much more interesting. It won't rip apart our simulation. It'll just hopefully just add detail on the edges of it. So now this is much better. I can see it already. We have the billowing smoke. It's still billowing now. It's just that the edges are broken up. What disturbance is trying to do, essentially, like what is this force that we're simulating? Like temperature is based in reality, velocity is based in reality. What is disturbance? Disturbance is emulating the little micro air currents. The fact that air in your room, or outside especially, and at different levels of the atmosphere, is not static. It's not just dead air. There's usually tiny little bits of motion in the air. And as our smoke simulation and as our temperature reaches those little currents, we want that to be taken into account. So look how much detail there is now. Amazing. It looks way better now, just from adding disturbance. And again, though, it can't just add disturbance. You have to control it. The defaults were not good for us. The temperature being the thing was not good for us. And the default size was not good for us. So changing it to what we changed it to gets us there. We start to see now combinations of things that we're doing to make good effect. So, for example, down here, this billow right there, around frame 70, it billows out because of the velocity in our source, and the disturbance is hitting it quickly. So you get a really nice poof. And it's cool because it sticks out because the dissipation that we did we see that we have, it's very like thin and smoky there right now. So we have that thin smokiness, and then all of a sudden we have a crisp new plume push through it. That kind of stuff, that kind of subtle work is what makes this look good. And yeah, so that's pretty good. I mean, we're not even done yet, so we can keep going. But this is looking much better now already. This looks like something. It looks like our simulation's almost done anyway. I'm going to click this button here. This says disconnect. What this means is I can keep this window around and make a new flipbook, but I can always just bring this back up and use it to compare. So there we go. So that's looking pretty rad. So I'm happy with that. I'm actually going to make another merge and put it up here. I'm going to have 2 gas disturbs. What this will do is I can have it work on different size blocks. So I'm going to say like 0.01. This one will be even smaller because I know that right now I'm at 300. When I go down to 600, there's going to be twice as much detail everywhere. I want to be able to capture that smaller detail with this smaller disturbance. So what I can do is they're both 0.75. I can maybe have the smaller one not be as powerful. In fact, I can make this one 1, make it a little bit more powerful. This one could be a little less powerful because it's a smaller detail anyway. So that kind of follows logically. So that's cool. Again, we're not going to see the result of that too much until we go to the higher resolution. So in fact, you know what? Let's not go to the higher resolution yet. Let's just be happy with this for now. Wait, cool. So let's move on. So that's how to use the disturb in the normal fashion. I want to touch real quick on a cool way you can hack this to control it even more. There's an idea here of control settings, and you can say use control field. This could be any field you want. Typically it's density because you want to do something about where the smoke is. Now this by default already does this cutoff thing where it says, you know, look at the threshold field and evaluate if there's less, do a thing. You can use any field on top of that in control settings. In fact, all these microsolvers have this, where you could say use control field. Basically, you can apply some influence where there's smoke, do it more, where there's less smoke, do it less. You can remap it, you can do whatever you want. A cool way you can do this is we can say let's use the velocity field where there is more velocity, where it is moving faster. That's when it should run into more resistance from the air. I have found, and others have found, this to work very well, especially, again, if there is smoke that's billowing, it's shooting out of something. We may not, gas disturb in its normal state is just looking at, let's say, density and saying, oh, how dense are you? And it'll just apply some disturbance every frame. We might need it to apply a lot of disturbance quickly when it's moving fast. Again, if it's being shot out of something like a steam pipe or something like that. So what you can do is you can say use control field. You can say really do it. So really have this affect it. The problem is that this is not set up to take a vector field as a control field. It really wants to use density or temperature or something usually. If you want, you can still use velocity, but what you're going to have to do is modify the node. Right click and hold, allow editing of contents. See, the lock is unlocked. Disturb vector field is the version we're using right now. There's a switch here. See how this one's dotted and this one's dotted? That means we're not using them. This one's being used because we told it to. Disturb field is vector field. That's why we're using the disturb vector field one. Now inside here, there's control field. Oop, I did not mean to pull that off. I did not mean to cut it. Come back. Okay, so we said the disturb, the control field is vel. So, and again, that's a vector field. So what you have to do is take this control field thing, change it to be vector field so it actually reads it incorrectly. and then use the length to turn that into a speed. The length of a vector is how fast it's going. The velocity on its own is a direction in addition to the length of the direction being how fast it's going. This basically just boils down and says how long is the velocity vector. That's how fast it's going. So now, much the way that this used to be, let's say density, saying do something more where there's more density, this is saying do this more if there is more speed. I'm not going to use that in this lesson because I think we already have a very good result. I had planned on using it. I still do use this, but I don't want to do both. And that is how you do that. And you'll use this less often. So I'm going to use the thing that you're going to use more often, which is the way we had it set up already. So I'm going to go to match current definition, which will undo everything that we did in here. You can see it's not, that length thing is not there anymore. And this is back to being float. I will turn off control field and just keep it the way it was. But that is a pretty good tip. I've seen people on the internet have liked that about that old Applied Houdini lesson, so I want to still teach it. And there you go. And that's how you do it. All right. So we've got a few forces acting on this now. As we know, we've got buoyancy sending it up. We've got the initial source velocity of the way it's shooting out of whatever's making this effect in the first place. And we got the disturbance. And we also have the diffusion. One thing that could be cool is we talked about tiny little micro air currents and all that jazz, but what it can be nice is a much larger scale, bigger, slower movement of the air. Let's say just like a general wind. So not micro air currents, just wind. So instead of using the actual wind, what we'll also use is gas turbulence. Gas turbulence in general is just a good idea because it kind of just introduces just some like greater power to just kind of gently nudge it in certain directions. So especially if you're trying to design multiple smoke sims, it can be nice to just use a gas turbulence. So as usual, by default, let's just take a look at it. By default, it's a fairly it will be a powerful force if you let it. So 0.15. And actually, while we do this, I'm going to bring this down to 150 just so this runs faster. So let's start this at 1, just to see it. And in fact, to really see it, well, you can see it's tearing it apart, but we know it's working. The size is the key. So once again, 0.65 is a fairly large feature. You remember what 0.3 looked like a moment ago when we had that box. We actually have the option of visualizing the turbulence as opposed to the thing. So you can see it's a pretty noisy, I mean it's structured, but it's a very small features on this. So it's ripping it apart pretty quickly. So I'm going to say let's go much higher than that. Now you can see, all right, that's something. Now there's much bigger features. We can go bigger than that. I want even larger features. And also, the pulse length is how long it takes to cycle through. So you can see how, the noise is changing and moving. Now this is not the velocity field of the sim. This is just the velocity field of the turbulence. This is the velocity that's being added to the sim, or modified anyway. So how fast it moves through that evolution of it changing is the pulse length. So 0.5 means it will, every half a second, it will cycle the field that you have here. So I'm going to say make it slow. I want it big and slow. That's the idea, to me, for turbulence. If the disturbance is small and fast for details, this is big and slow. Now you can see it's obviously kicking this around quite a bit. I'm going to turn off the visualized turbulence. I think you get it. So it's too much, and yet not enough. What I mean by that is it's pulling it apart too much. That's obvious. But I want the features probably to be even bigger. So let's bring this back down. I mean, the default was much smaller at 0.15. So we'll go back to that, and let's make it even bigger. I just want big, slow movements, as if, again, there's just kind of an idle airstream of some kind. I still feel like I'm seeing a little too much. But let's just let this go so we can compare. So there you go. It's kind of crazy. We can still see. Now remember also that we made our voxels much larger. We're still at the 150 voxel level. So the fact that it's not as clear and nice looking is partially due to that. That said, sorry about the burp. That said, it is still a crazy amount of force. Interesting. I like the swirling thing. That's cool. But hopefully that stays around. But this is obviously way too much. So I'm going to say, we just need a nudge. We just need a slight nudge. Because this is going to be applied on every frame. Even a slight nudge can add up over time. Actually, I'm going to, instead of making a flipbook for this yet, I'm going to go back to 300 because I do want to see it with the detail. I should mention, while we jump around in our uniform divisions from, 150 to 300 to eventually 600, it will affect the simulation. You will not get the same exact simulation with just with more detail at a higher resolution. You can usually jump pretty safely from, let's say, 150 to 300 or 300 to 600. That's okay. But jumping from, let's say, 150 to 600, you can literally do it, but you should expect your simulation to look substantially different. Little things like the detail of the disturbance may not have a big impact, but the very sourcing of the velocity vectors, of the temperature, and sure, some of the disturbance and the turbulence and everything else, it will all kind of butterfly effect, over every frame. And so by the end of the 120, you can have a substantially different result. So again, feel free to work at a lower resolution to just generally be like, this turbulence is too high. Or at a higher resolution, this disturbance is making some nice details. But you're not really going to have a strong idea of the literal silhouette, the literal final shape of what you're doing until you're working at the higher resolutions. At least half of your final resolution. There is a gas resize that we'll talk about later in some future Houdini lesson. But that is a whole different kind of workflow that I don't really want to get into right now. This is usually fine. Usually you don't have a very specific plan for the exact silhouette, meaning the outline of your smoke anyway. At any rate, so here we are. So here is enough frames probably to talk about it. We still see all of our detail, which is awesome. We still have a pretty strong upward movement. It's not being torn apart by the turbulence. And this is what I like to see from turbulence. I like to see a very broad general change. And that's what we're getting here. We're getting some swirling effect. We're getting, I don't really know. I guess swirling effect is probably the best way to put it, which is cool. I like seeing some of it come down. I like seeing it. It looks like it's kind of hooking around to the right here, which is pretty rad. Hopefully that continues to the end of the frame range. That's what's super, super cool. Because again, when these things happen in real life, whether it's a bomb or a smokestack, it's not in a vacuum. It's in the world. So we get so preoccupied with simulating the effect itself that we forget about its interaction with the world at large. And so that's what we get with the turbulence. It's just this kind of like gentle touch. So this is super rad. This came out better than I had hoped. So moving into the next chapter, we can see there's swirling. Like here. Some of it can be lost, and it can be accentuated. And that will be the last microsolver we talk about will hopefully boost that a little bit. And that's the vortex confinement. Cool. I'm gonna save this one also. Like that. So as I started to talk about in the previous chapter, a common thing in fluid sims of any kind, whether it's literally water or, in this case, smoke, which is a fluid also, you get swirls. That's what we like about it. We like swirly things. They look cool. The problem is volume sims, for technical reasons I won't go into exactly, they kind of have a sense of entropy to them. They kind of lose, and it's not always very totally obvious, but they lose some of their character. They can lose details over time as the data is pushed from voxels to some other voxels to some other voxels. You kind of lose a little bit of the fidelity. You lose a little bit of what exactly is going on. Again, in the real world, there are specific air molecules, and they are specifically moving to new specific locations. In a volume sim, we are kind of just generalizing that by having a static grid and moving data around. But the data can get kind of lost a little bit as it moves through it. So this has been a known issue for a long time. You kind of don't know what you're missing, maybe even. Like, this looks pretty good, but there is probably a good deal of swirliness being lost here that would be nice to get back. So with that in mind, there is the idea of vortex confinement. Also, I'm looking at this. I think that when we moved our source up one, we never moved our camera up one. So it's kind of getting... I mean, it's going to get cut off in the top anyway, but I'm going to take a moment here to maybe move this up. This is probably not the time to do this, but here we go. Moved up. Okay, back in here. So we have vortex confinement. Again, this is on here too, in case you forget. Confinement. You can see it's such an important thing that it's even built into the defaults. Once again, we'll just throw that on the pile here. The funny thing about the vortex confinement is that control field is on by default on this one, as opposed to the other various control settings ones. And I'm not sure why it's on by default. It's looking for a field called confinement, which doesn't exist. You can create one, but you don't get it for free. Anyway, just turn it off. It will do its work just fine. I will just let it do it overall. Let's see what this looks like with just the default confinement settings. So there we go. Again, this is going to be a subtle difference, but it helps to keep certain roiling columns more tightly together. I'm going to say, let's not have this finish. It already helps a little bit. Again, it's fairly subtle, but you might as well have it. Let's double it. Double the dose. Let's see what that looks like, and then we'll compare it to our previous one. All right, so there we are. Here's our two versions. The one on the left here is with our vorticity confinement. The one on the right is without. Obviously, not a huge difference. It is a subtle difference. I would say in particular, look in this region here, these kind of spinning tubes. It does tend to be better preserved here than on the one on the right, where we have it kind of blurs out and kind of gets lost. But, you know, would you miss it? I don't know. I think it's just nice to know that the curls and twists are being better preserved, especially, again, even like these big sweeping ones, but especially the small ones here when it's first getting source. If we just look at the last frame, you can see that there is a difference. It's not like one is hugely better or not, but there's just tends to be more streaking and blurring, and I do see it is like a little crisper in certain areas on here. So, you know, your mileage may vary, but that's the difference. So you might as well have it. It doesn't hurt. And that's it for microsolvers in this lesson. Let's talk about one more thing, though. So when we talk about fluid simulations, which include, again, smoke, as well as like actual, like let's say liquids, a lot of the way that they look is governed by pressure. You know, when we talked about temperature moving up and creating a velocity field that then kind of sucked around behind it. This is all like because of pressure calculations. We don't just have things moving anywhere they want. They are moving because a velocity wants to move that way, and a pressure field is saying, well, you are allowed to move this way, which is maybe close to what you wanted to do. We talk about this a lot in the flip class, Liquids 1, but it's enough to say that pressure has a lot to do with this. Smoke is not being created or destroyed, except for when we are literally sourcing it in, we are literally creating it. But after that, presumably, it's in the sim and it just moves through the sim until it gradually dissipates. Now, there is another notion, though, where we can break pressure. We can break the idea that things are just moving along. When you have an explosion, there is that. It is adding a whole bunch of stuff. It's adding a whole bunch of pressure into a system. Again, this would be considered kind of a neutral system where stuff is just moving through the air. But an explosion is adding a whole bunch of heat and movement, and it's expanding. And that last word is what I want to talk about. Previously, in Volumes 2, we went that route, and in order to make it more interesting, I made it more explosive, and we talked about expansion. Let's talk about it now, even though we won't use it in our final simulation. You can if you like. Let's just do it. Let's get to it. So we have our volume source here, and I'm going to call this volume source temp density, and I guess val. To distinguish it from another volume source, where we will basically add to another field called divergence. Divergence is expansion. So here we go. I'll say I'll just say expansion. On the sky, we actually have that. We have a default one called expand, and you can see it is going to look for a divergence field or volume, and then add it to the Pyro's divergence field. What the divergence field does, instead of it just being density, where the density just exists and does its thing, or temperature, where it exists, it contributes to buoyancy, where divergence exists, it's going to move everything out in every direction away from it. It's going to copy, it's going to drag the density, it's going to drag the temperature with it, and it will basically be an explosive force, or a suction force if you provided negative numbers. So now, it's erroring out because we haven't really pointed to anything. Let's point to our regular old source. Now, there is no divergence field, as we know. So what we can just say is, just you treat the density field. Just read that volume in, and add it to the divergence field. And multiply by 1. That will be key. So here it is by default. We can't really tell that anything different is going on. I mean, it must be a little bit, but there's just not that much. I guess I can kind of see it. It's expanding. As usual, multiples of 10 will bring this problem out, or this out much clearer. So now you can see. By adding divergence in, and we'll just blow it out for the sake of argument. By adding divergence in, it will cause it to expand. That could be useful to you. If you're trying to achieve an effect where something expands rapidly, again, usually because it's an explosion. The Pyro Solver, when we do explosions later on, and we have fuel, and the temperature will ignite the fuel, it's going to add to the divergence field. It's going to create divergence, and that is simply how to do an explosion. Now, we're not doing combustion yet here. Oh, got our old sim there still. We're not doing combustion yet here, but I did want to talk about it again because I used to talk about it in the old volumes too, or I guess Dynamics too, and you might be doing something. There's still plenty of effects that involve expansion. As you can see, you know, the disturbances take some time to kind of catch up to it, so you might need to either have higher disturbance at first, or do that other thing we talked about where you can hack it and make it, you know, do it for you, or you can have it do more disturbance. It's based on how fast it's moving, but you can see it's this huge billowing thing now. Wish that old sim was not there. Anyway, so that's what divergence does. It will. We're still adding it. You need to. You probably don't want to just take the density and add it. You might want to be more clever about where you add divergence. You might take, let's say, for example, the density volume, further add noise to it, further reduce it, so that it's only adding divergence in certain areas. But that something to that effect would be good. And so that's a way that you can get this big explosion-y looking pyroclastic effect is through divergence. That said, that's what that effect is. That is a pyroclastic effect. I don't really want to do that. I think it's a little less interesting than what we were already doing, which is a more delicate turbulence dissipation thing. But that's how you would do it. So divergence is there at your disposal should you want to. As usual, you can visualize it as well under guides. You can turn on divergence. We'll turn off density here. It's just the smoke pattern that we talked about. So it expands immediately and then continues from there. If this was being advected up through it also, the whole thing would explode very quickly, and not explode in a good way. You can have it do that. You can have the divergence be advected with it, but we're not going to go over that because it's just not what we're doing. So I'll keep it here. I'm just going to disable it in case I change my mind, but I don't think we're going to use it. But it is divergence. So now that we've talked about that last thing that we're not going to use anyway, we are done. And we're done in the sense that we're not going to add any more microsolvers to it. We've got quite a setup going here already. Let's cache it, and let's talk about final HQ stuff. What am I typing caching for? Geometry node, call that caching. Again, I like to have like affiliated nodes be like kind of purple. I don't know why I do this. I can even do that to like make it look cool. This literally parents this to that, but seeing as this has no transform anyway, it hasn't moved in space, doesn't really do anything. I just like the way it looks. So, okay, how do we get our sim? We get our sim with dop import fields. Remember, the fields are all the individual things that we want: density, temperature, velocity. So let's point to the simulation network. Let's say the default object is that smoke object that I forget what it's called. So I'm just going to put smoke star. So it's going to get any object that starts with smoke. We actually could just look. It's called smoke object 1 apparently. So all the fields live inside this object. When we were running this simulation, and we middle click and hold, it's smoke object 1, and these are the various fields that we can get. These are the fields that exist. You can see there's the pressure. We don't need that, but that's that thing we were just talking about with divergence. Velocity, density, temperature, those are the ones that we care about. So we just say density. So right off the bat, we can see it's working. We're getting it now. And it's important to be in hide other objects mode so that we're not just seeing the sim by accident. I want to make sure that I'm actually getting the density field, which I am. So we got density. We've got temperature. Temperature we're not actually really going to need to render with in this lesson, but we might need it in the next lesson when we talk more about rendering. We definitely need the velocity because we need that for motion blur. Now the velocity, it's a bunch of vectors pointing every which way, and looking at them as if they were a smoke volume doesn't make any sense. So just say that this is invisible. In fact, make the temperature invisible too, because we just really care about seeing the density. So we have them. There we go. These are now in Houdini volume form. That's why the color is different. It's brighter, or it's more turquoise, I guess. And you can see it's .x, .y, and .z. If these were VDBs, it would just be vel. Back when it was a source, you can see there's this blue, and the velocity was just one thing. So unfortunately, that's a little bit of a funny thing, but it's necessary, at least for now. The simulations can't or don't anyway, run in VDB. They don't run in that modified form where we only store information where we want it. It's kind of assumed, at least for now, that we need all the information all the time when we're doing a simulation. So that's why it's like that. I think we turned off our density. There we go. Bring that back so we see it here in our simulation. So we need to know about the velocities that are out here, even if they're not right here, because they might still affect it. So anyway, so that's kind of why that it is a regular Houdini volume, or volumes, because Houdini volumes don't have a notion of vectors. They have to have 3 each. So there you go. So we've got all 3 of those things. What else might we need here? We're going to need to actually cache this. I'll tell you that. So type file cache, and we'll just say file cache sim, something like that. Just delete this whole thing. I'm going to say put it in job, which again is our project. Put it in geo, and then we'll call it results.version0. And we can put the current frame number with F4. That'll pad it to 4 digits. .bgeo is Houdini's native format, and .sc is like the bigger file format but faster to read. If we middle click this, you can see how it resolves. We've got the path to our project, and then geo, you can see this is the 4-digit padded frame number. So that's what we'll save to. So very good. So that's pretty self-explanatory. We're not going to cache it just yet because we're going to want to do it at the 600 voxels, and we need to do a couple of other things too. I'm going to put a null here though. I'm going to say this is the out. Save that. And let's see. Let's do some takes. We talked about takes in the last lesson. Where is my take list? I always assume that the main take is the low quality take, so we don't need to make a separate low quality take. In fact, we don't want to, because these should be overrides. We want to do all of our work in the general area. So here we are in HQ mode. What do we want? We want this to be 600 voxels. So I'll include that. Say 600. And as you recall, in main, it'll go back to being 300. Just that will be the only thing that translates over. And you know what? Let's break this up into another chapter. So that's it for now. That's caching. All right, so let's talk a little more about the HQ stuff. Now that we made a HQ, there you go. Now we made an HQ mode, we can either click save the disk here, or we can always have this cache, the HQ mode. I kind of prefer that. So now when we click save the disk, it'll just make those changes. In fact, let's make sure that the simulation starts over and doesn't just read its cache. And then once we have it, it errors out. There is no cache on the disk, but once we have the cache on the disk, it will read it. So keep that on, even though it's erroring right now. One other thing we will really want to do in preparation for the next lesson, we will render it this lesson, but there's a notion of rest fields. Rest fields can be enabled on the smoke object. Go to fields and scroll down, or I guess it's not there. Go to initial data. There it is. I don't know why it's here. Initial data, go to add rest field. You see if we middle click, or let's go forward a frame. You'll see we have, we still don't have it. Who would have thought? You gotta go to advanced. You gotta go to rest field. You gotta say enable rest field, even though I just asked for one. So now if we go forward a frame, now we'll definitely see it. We see rest and rest 2. See, it says dual rest fields. Rest fields we'll talk much more about in the next class because it has more to do with rendering. But I will say, for now, turn on rest advection rate to 1 because we want the fields to move at full speed. And really, really quick, what it's going to do is when the voxels are being sourced into our simulation, it's going to remember where in space they were, the actual X, Y, and Z coordinates of them. And then as they move through space, those coordinates are going to be stored in voxels, so they'll always know where they came from, or at least they will for 50 frames. And then it will have half that time, 25 frames, it will start over again. So we're going to have two different rest fields that are tracking that. Again, don't worry too much. We just need to have this data saved now so that we can talk about it more at length in the next lesson. And because we're making them, we need to save them. So put rest and put rest2. Again, make these invisible. Make sure that we're getting them at all. And we are, so that's good. These are going to be coordinate systems stored in our simulation that will allow us to add more rendered detail, even more detail to our final sim. So again, we'll talk about that later. So there you go. That is that. The very last thing I would say is if you had fast moving smoke, again, if it was being shot out the side of something and it had to cover a lot of space between frames, it is a very good idea to increase your substeps. This will increase your simulations literally this much. If your simulation takes 3 seconds and you say 2 substeps, it will take 6 seconds. You're literally just saying do more entire solves between frames. That is extremely necessary, though, to get a high quality simulation. Again, if you had steam shooting out of a pipe at a wall, so it's moving one direction quickly and then it's changing direction quickly, or if the colliders that are moving through your smoke are moving quickly, all those things will cause you to have to increase your substeps. If you're going to run this overnight anyway, it still shouldn't be the end of the world. I mean, we don't need to because we don't have anything that's particularly fast moving. It's not going to look noticeably better if your stuff isn't moving fast. So there's no point of just doing it just because. Just keep that in mind that solves a lot of problems. Smoke passing through colliders, smoke moving very fast, and it has to be affected by disturbance, by turbulence, by dissipate between frames. You'll just need more substeps. An interesting note that if you have, let's say, max substeps of 4 and min of 1, how will it know which to do or how many to do? It uses the CFL condition here. Basically, this says how fast are the fastest velocities? How fast can it be going? Is it going to be skipping over too many voxels? If it is, and this is like how many voxels it could skip over, if it's going to be skipping over voxels, give me as many substeps as I can so that I'm not skipping over voxels with my velocity. So suffice to say, you can usually just keep this at the default. And if you want to ensure that you're getting all the substeps, a lot of people are paranoid about these two numbers not being the same. I don't think you really need to worry. I think letting it do the automatic choice has usually been fine to me. But if you want to be absolutely sure, you can just keep these numbers pegged to each other. Obviously, you can copy parameter. Some people do this, and then you just never have to worry about it. But we're just going to keep ours at 1. And just another reiteration, if you get an error, especially now at 600 voxels, it's going to be a lot of voxels, even more than before. It's going to be another 8 times 27, so it's going to be in the hundreds. You might need to turn use OpenCL off. It'll be slower, but and your result will be a little bit different actually. But if you can't do it, you can't do it. So you turn it off. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to go for it. I think it can handle it. That should do it, honestly. So now all we got to do now is just say, do the thing. There it is. So this will take a little bit, and we'll take a look at the result on the other side. All right, so it's all done. There it is. I'm going to go into smooth shaded to get rid of the bounding box. I'll keep the grid on. Let's see what this looks like, and then we'll move on to our basic rendering stuff, and we'll be done. Cool. All right, so here's the result of our sim, and it looks really cool. We've got these beautiful cache files on our disk. We've got all that detail. It's very crisp. It's all very We got this jagged, that's what we want. We want the broken up silhouette here. We got a cool shape from the turbulence. It looks largely how the 300 voxel shape looked also, with this kind of hook thing. We've got nice swirling motion up here, just super rad. Yeah, so this came out really nice. Let's now just set up a ground plane, some materials, and we'll render it. Yeah. All right. So we could look at this forever, I'm sure, but let's get to the actual rendering stuff. So bump out here. Oh, escape. We don't want to see this. Turn off all this stuff, like your simulation, the caching thing even, the source. Let us just make a ground plane. And this will be a grid. Just something flat in the ground, obviously. We'll make it larger, so 4. Let us rotate it so that it's facing the camera. As you can see, it's about -30 degrees. Come back in here, make it a NURBS plane, and then what we can do with that is we can grab, oh, that was weird. We can grab the last row here and make it go up. What is going on here? So go into point selection mode, press T, go up. Now we go back into our camera and we can finish it, go up. Just make it go up to around here. So that's cool. So we've got a nice ground plane, and we will not technically render that. Let's make a bunch of render nodes. So let's make a render ground plane. I think I may have talked about this last class, but if I didn't, the idea here is we want to be able to build up our volumes, our geometry, free from worrying about, we forgot to put a null here. We don't have to worry about which, like, if I try to render the ground plane, but I accidentally have the display on this, it's going to look like that. But what we do instead typically is we just use an object merge to point to the exact node that we want rendered, like that. And into this object. And now we retrieve the exact node that we want to render, bring it into this node, say into this object, so all the transforms that are applied, meaning the transform on the ground plane thing here itself, the scale and the rotation. And now this will always represent the exact node that we wanted to render. So I'm going to make that red. Oop. So we got the ground plane. We need to get our smoke, obviously. So same thing. We make an object merge. We point to where it's coming from, to the out here. Say into this object just in case. And we should see it. Here it is. Make it red because it's cool. This moves, as we know. So make sure that we have under the sampling tab, velocity blur. That means for volumes, it's going to look for these velocity volumes. It's just a built-in known thing. For point-based geometry, it's going to look for the V attribute. So Houdini knows to look for, one or the other. So there you go. So that's basically it in terms of render nodes. Just those two. And let's see. Let's make our mantra node. Go to the out context. Mantra. So out is, like last time, writing geometry out, writing pictures out, writing, whatever out. This should be a frame range. It already found our camera. Let's write it to job, which again is our project, /render /final render dot version 0 dot again f4, which will pad it, and do .exr, which is kind of the industry standard, and Houdini's own image player will read anyway. So there it is. It looks correct. What else we need to do? At first, for our test, let's do half resolution. And let's go over to rendering. We want to allow motion blur. We want to do physically based rendering. All this other stuff we'll talk about in the next class. We're not going to get into that now. There's a lot to talk about. We want to force render only the render objects. So if you click here, you'll see it finds them. We don't want this asterisk here that's by default. This means render anything that happens to have its display flag on, meaning the blue thing. We want it to not render anything, but then always force render whether these are on or off. So even if these are not on the viewport, this will still force that to be rendered. So that's easy enough. And that is it. That's it for that. So let's go find a frame. Well, we're already on a frame. That's probably fine. And let's see. Let's see what that looks like. You know, I have a suspicion that this caching thing is going to mess with us, so I'm going to delete that. I did that just for visual flair before, and it's not worth this getting screwed up somehow. Anyway, so we click render, and you'll see we'll have our first version of this cool thing. And again, we're looking at it at half resolution right now. There we go. And we have something. We've got smoke. We've got shadows. We've got our background. We've got a fairly high resolution smoke that will take, you know, the higher the resolution doesn't just mean that it will be, you know, more details. It means that it will take longer to render. So good. So we know, roughly speaking, that it works. So I'm going to say stop, and let's talk about some materials real quick. So we're going to want to have a material that we can control the settings on the smoke, and material for the background. And again, not much else. We're not going to do much else with this. Grab a principled shader, and let's give it a color. Let's make it be like essentially red, maybe, but maybe with maybe a little less red. So just kind of pinkish, like that. Well, yeah. So it's basically, I mean, you can see what it basically is. It's like 0.1, and we also don't want it to be reflective, which it is by default. So let's go look at this again. I'll unpause it. Let's go to the ground plane and say you have that. It lives under the material land over there. So you'll see now it'll start to render over. It'll be the pink color now. This is just so that our smoke stands out more. It was hard to see it before. And for the material palette, let's grab billowy smoke, which is here. Billowy smoke is really just the pyro shader, but with some defaults on it. So if you were to click on this, it is, well, I guess it's not true. This is the old volume model. So never mind, disregard that. Anyway, it's basic smoky settings. So we'll go to render smoke. We'll go find billowy smoke. It'll probably look largely the same. Well, we've got it's reading the temperature right now, which is funny. We don't actually want to do that, so let's just turn temperature off. We just want it to be a regular old smoke. So that's cool. And the only other thing I would say, even though I said that this was going to be a fairly basic rendering, it might be cool to go to the skylight. The skylight, you know, it has that just general blue sky by default. So I'm going to take this. I'm going to take a snapshot of it so you can see what it's going to look like in a second. Here's what it usually looks like. You know, it's blue in the sky. It's brown on the kind of on the ground. So it's just kind of a generic, you're outside. If we turn that off, it gives us the option to actually put an environment map in here. So when it's on, we can't do it. If it's off, we can. Environment map will allow us to go shop for a picture to wrap around the sky instead. Houdini comes with some under this Houdini file system, Houdini pick, high dynamic range image. High dynamic range images are simply images that have bright spots and dark spots in them. So they're usually an image. I'm going to choose this garage one. And we'll see it, and there it is. So it tends to be an image that has like a bright area, like this. This skylight is very bright. There are values, light values that are way higher than 1. And then there's dark areas like back here where these cars are. So we're in a parking garage. This will all cast light down onto our thing. You can already see it. It looks really cool. Again, I don't want to see it in the viewport usually, so I'm going to turn that off. But now, if I were to see what that looks like, it's going to be way more interesting. So from it's kind of flat here to it's got this nice highlights coming down from the top. You can see the shadows are not as flat anymore either. Like this was like a flat shade. Now there's like different levels of it. I mean, this is approximating real life lighting because it is literally real life lighting. So you're getting light cast on this from all angles, but different values of light being cast on all angles. So it's a big jump. This is the kind of stuff we'll talk about in the rendering section. It's not enough to just render it. You have to render it well. So there you go. You got to simulate it well. You got to source it well. You got to simulate it well. You got to render it well. And then later on, somebody else will have to composite it well. Maybe even you, depending on how many people you got in your team. So there you go. That's enough for me to say, this is going to look really cool. Save this. I might even move the camera again because it looks like it kind of leans to the right, doesn't it? I'm going to move the camera over slightly. Just a little bit. Like that. I just want it to be centered more. I want to see, where's my center thing? There we go. So when you're clicking on the camera, you'll get this camera reticle. You can actually use this to move it too. I just want it right in the middle. Very cool. Okay, that's it. We are literally done. We don't need to make a takes thing for the rendering. We'll do that next lesson. This is enough. We're rendering the high resolution thing. Oh, turn off override camera resolution. Save it. And that is it. We will render it now and we'll rejoice and we will pat ourselves on the back. So all you gotta do, click render to disk. Turn that off first, actually. I don't want to accidentally move my camera later. Okay, render to disk. And finally, we have our result. Looks really, really good. We have just so much detail, both in terms of visual complexity and also in terms of the actual way it moves around. Just to recap what we learned, we made a source, which was a moving sphere, but it wasn't just a sphere. We had lots of detail in the actual sourced area. We have a detailed temperature in the source. We had velocity, which helps really add a lot of character, the way it kind of pulses when it adds smoke into the sim. We have this nice subtle turbulence that kind of whips it around and makes it into these cool looking like vortex-like bands. We have our vortex confinement, which helps reinforce that. We have our disturbance, which is really did quite a bit in terms of helping us achieve all of this actual detail on here. You know, having multiple levels of disturbance to get bigger features and smaller features. Man, what else did we learn? We learned about buoyancy. We learned about love and friendship and the importance of sticking together through hard times. So, in conclusion, we learned how to simulate smoke, and it looks really cool, and I hope you learned a lot from this. Keep those caches around, because we're just going to use them in the next lesson. Make sure they had those rest fields in them and whatnot. And, you know, it already looks pretty cool in terms of the render, but there's a lot to really fully understand if you're going to become an expert in all things volumes. So let's talk about that in Volume 3.